Whenever I see good looking water in a video game, I get this funny little tingly feeling in my brain, and when you add to this the sound effects and ambience that come with coastal and aquatic environments, that's when the immersion hits just right. But while it's easy to get something that looks like water, it's not easy to get water right, and there are a lot of things that you'll need to get right. There are so many random elements at play, like waves, ripples, splashes, foam, water physics and interaction, wakes, fog, subsurface scattering and reflections, refractions, god rays, caustic, specularity, the Fresnel effect?
Fresnel.
Not to mention that all of this has to be optimized enough to run on a smart toaster. Needless to say, this is complicated stuff. And if you want to add on top of that the ability to scoop up a bucket of water and pour it on the ground, well, you've got a challenge ahead of you, to put it mildly. This is why I've been super curious about how a high quality voxel sandbox game like Hytale is planning on tackling this issue. And I think it's something important to talk about right now, as the engine has recently been rebuilt in C++. At this stage in Hytale's development, the fundamental mechanics are what matters most, and I can't think of many mechanics more fundamental than water. Water is clearly something the developers care a lot about, judging from what they've shown us from the ocean biome with tropical islands, ocean exploration, deep dark waters full of terrible creatures, as well as underground rivers. Unfortunately, we haven't actually seen any water in the new engine yet, so this video may age poorly, but hey, at least we have the old engine as a reference. In the very beginning, it looks like they added texture to the water, which they later moved away from, opting for a slightly more realistic, plain-colored wavy surface. We can also see that the water also has a diffused reflection of the environment and the reflection of the sun of the waves, also known as specular reflection. Waves are simulated with vertex displacement. Basically, each surface is built up from two triangles and the corners bob up and down, which creates a wave effect when you have enough blocks of water. And now they also add additional ripples in the water, which is done through using normal maps, which is like a texture that fakes the way the light bounces off the mesh. That gave the water enough texture by itself, so they decided to remove the old texture altogether, going for a more realistic look. If you want to learn more about how water is made in Hytale, make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where I will go into more detail. Speaking of detail, a nice touch here is that there is a little bit of foam added to the edges of the water and around objects that penetrate the surface. Most of the water is a light saturated blue, but it gets darker in colder biomes and green in the swamp. Unlike in Minecraft, where you can see pretty much everything underwater, here you can see that when water gets deeper, it gets more opaque, which makes sense. When you're at sea, you can't really see what happens beneath the surface. And that's kind of why thalassophobia is so common. Here, you can clearly see that after a certain depth, the seabed is no longer visible, and the game probably stops rendering it altogether to save on performance. Despite being more realistic, not being able to see what happens under the water could be a downside, as it makes the ocean less visually interesting and could make ocean exploration less fun if you can't see what's beneath you, as you're more likely to miss things that would otherwise interest you, like a pirate ship or an ocean temple. However, if you do dive below the surface, you can see that this is where Hytale's water really shines, pun intended, with the seabed covered in dancing patterns of light, this is known as caustics, as well as a whole bunch of air bubbles, which when put together create a very dynamic aquatic atmosphere, made even better by the muted sounds and aquatic ambience you get when you dive underwater. What I'm really missing here are god rays from the sun that penetrate the surface of the water, but this should be a pretty simple addition that I wouldn't be surprised if they've already added. The water is generally very clear when you're diving, and you can see quite far underwater, which makes sense since they're putting a lot of effort into the aquatic environment. When you dive into the swamp though, the water gets much darker, but water is still very clear, which is really strange. So I think this will probably change, with more fog and clouded water. The ocean is clearly something they have big plans for, since already in the trailer they presented scuba gear, lots of aquatic fauna and enemies, coral biome, deep sea, as well as a lot of underwater foliage. Even the water surface has a lot of variation for water foliage for pretty much all different biomes. There are also lily pads, though they are honestly quite plain and boring, and they don't actually stick to the surface of the water like they do in Vintage Story. But overall, the water in Hytale looks pretty good. It looks like water, so it does its job. It can be quite pretty when you see the sun or sunset reflecting in it, but normally it looks very plain and boring. The lighting makes the water look a bit like plastic, which could be intentional as a nod to retro games, but it's not all that inspiring. My main issue with the water isn't actually with the lighting though, but rather with the shape of the waves. No matter where you are, the waves look the same. There is no distinction between small, still bodies of water and open waters like the ocean. In real life, open waters are really intimidating as the waves there can become huge, especially during storms, but in Hytale that would mean the waves would have to go outside of their designated voxels on the grid, which would of course come with a lot of issues. However, and I think this is important to realize, these are not issues that can't be overcome. It's not necessarily a big deal if we have some cases where the waves clip through blocks above the ocean. The main issues would arise when there are water source blocks missing from the ocean surface, as the player would have to be able to find the missing source to fill it. This will take some experimentation, but in some cases we could even make it our strength. For example, if there are a bunch of missing water blocks in the ocean, it could turn into a whirlpool. Either way, it's definitely something we can accomplish, as we have already seen a proof of concept for this with Hobno's physics mod in Minecraft, where larger waves start forming when you get a certain amount of blocks away from shore. This is still far from an ideal solution in terms of appearance and functionality, but even this simple implementation makes the water much more dynamic and makes ocean exploration way more interesting. So I think we can do better, much better, and I also think that it's going to be extremely important to get water right, and especially the ocean. At the core of Hytale's experience is adventure, and there are a few settings more suited for adventure than the sea. To achieve that sense of adventure, the surface of the ocean needs to be spectacular and immersive instead of an endless flat plain with some measly ripples here and there. Hytale is a fresh slate, so this is a golden opportunity to set new standards for what water can look like in a sandbox game. And if we're talking about games that create a sense of adventure, we need to look at Sea of Thieves. The water in Sea of Thieves does not look realistic. It looks better than real life. It is stylized and it is beautiful, like a romanticized painting of stormy waters. The shape of the waves here are irregular and exaggerated, giving them a fun but unpredictable feel, and the deep blues mixed with the prominent highlights makes the water vibrant and beautiful. These elements work together nicely, as when the peaks of the waves are higher, the light has less water to pass through, and you get more of these eye-catching highlights. This is called subsurface scattering, and the effect is greatly exaggerated here compared to real life. The procedurally generated foam is balanced but reserved, stylized but not so heavily that it looks unrealistic, and the sea spray VFX really helps sell the effect. As a finishing touch, the shader scatters specks of light reflecting in the water using specular highlights to make the sea appear as if it's glittering. Compared to the art style of the rest of the game, the way this water behaves is very realistic, and the rationale behind that decision was that they looked at a bunch of CGI movies and noticed that no matter how stylized the movie is, the water tends to be more on the realistic side. They did experiment with simplifying the shape of the water, but that only ended up making the water look, quote, less good, so they opted not to do that, and instead settled for just stylizing the foam and gave very intentional boosts to the subsurface scattering, which is what creates the pretty highlights at the peaks of the waves. What they ultimately learned from this process was that stylized art should have a physical basis, by taking a realistic physical phenomenon and giving it a stylistic interpretation. That way, you get a design that looks fantastical but acts believable. Aesthetic, but still immersive. Another game that exemplifies this philosophy is Valheim, and it really showcases that no matter how low fidelity a game is, it will look way better if you build it on top of realistic visual effects. Well, at least for 3D games. For example, Valheim's water looks quite realistic, but still adds stylistic interpretation through its low-resolution foam. Still water is also unusually clear and reflective, which makes it look extremely pretty, especially during sunsets. Valheim is also a great example because, like Hytale, it has procedurally generated worlds where the player can change the environment. But Valheim would be an extremely different game if the water was just a flat plane with some shader effects slapped on top of it. Instead, the water is dynamic with larger and larger waves the further out at sea you get, and it's also affected by wind and weather. Since the ships have realistic sailing mechanics, traveling across the ocean is not just a mindless chore, but instead an epic voyage, and a dramatic battle for survival once a storm hits and your ship is being chased by a sea serpent. The developers could have said, we're making a low fidelity game here, so a more realistic ocean wouldn't fit, but luckily they realized how important it would be to the experience, and in the end, the ocean ended up becoming the beating heart of this game, the core of the entire adventure, connecting every part of the world. So maybe the water of Sea of Thieves, pretty as it is, isn't the style for Hytale, and maybe Valheim's water isn't it either. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the perfect catch-all solution here. I'm just trying to nudge you in the right direction. But either way, if we're going to find a style that works, a good place to start would be taking a page out of these books and start by building on top of more realistic simulations, as that will make it easier to iterate and create different design variations that we can potentially use. When you create a good underlying system, the shader artist can tweak a few parameters and get drastically different results, so the design challenge ends up becoming a very simple process of trial and error. The parameters for the water can also be changed depending on what dimension you're in, like in Ultraverse with extreme storms, maybe you can get some fantastical waves that go 20-30 blocks in height, or water that is completely clear, less reflective, more viscous, and anything you can really imagine. This will also allow modders to do way more with both the functionality and the aesthetics of the water, potentially allowing for more interesting creator content and making up for the fact that you can't hardcode new features or make your own custom shaders. And speaking of functionality, there also needs to be a water flow mechanic. We need to decide if the water should be finite like in Terraria or infinite using water sources like in Minecraft. Unless we wanted to go for something crazy like the Minecraft alpha water, but probably not. Treating water like a finite source would be tricky, but not impossible. The mod Water Physics Overhaul does exactly this, giving Minecraft a much more realistic water system. The game Portal Knights also has something like this, though the worlds aren't infinite in this game, so oceans aren't really a thing there. If you've ever played Terraria, you would know that the main issue with a system like this would be the lag you get when draining large bodies of water like an ocean. The way the water physics mod gets around this is by localizing water drainage to portions of the water, though this can look a bit strange when you've drained parts of a body of water. There are potentially ways to get around this, but even if you did, there would be issues like, how do you get a perpetual river or a waterfall? Even if you did some trickery with generating water at the top, where would the water go? Do you add a water cycle where the water evaporates and the rain fills the source back up again? Does that mean you need a realistic precipitation simulation? I don't know, but it sure seems like this would cause a lot more issues than it would solve. Water would also get a lot trickier to deal with, which could be an advantage depending on what you're going for. In a game like Oxygen Not Included, a lot of the challenge of the game is how you move liquids around. Making all water finite might be unfeasible, but I could definitely see potential in adding a whole new type of liquid that is finite, which would also add the mechanic into the game for whenever modders and creators would like to do something with it. But either way, using source blocks seems like the way to go for Hytale, and it would also seem like that's already what they're doing. In this one clip where the player jumps down into a cave, we see a stream of water on the side here, and while this water doesn't look great, when it flows, it steps down layer by layer instead of sloping, but this can be fixed with vertex displacement and probably already has been. But if we compare these steps to the adjacent blocks, we can see that the water steps down by 1/8 for each block it travels, which means that the water extends 7 blocks out from the source. In other words, it's exactly the same as Minecraft, which, I don't know, it doesn't feel right. The water in Vintage Story differentiates itself by extending 6 blocks instead, but honestly I like that even less. My main issue with flowing water in Minecraft is that when you try to add a current to a river, it will just end up looking wonky because the flowing water is at such a steep angle compared to flat water. So why not make water extend 10 blocks from the source instead? That would make clearing out foliage a lot quicker too. And one strange thing about Minecraft water is that it can't flow through non-full blocks like fences and trapdoors. That can be very helpful for creating mechanisms with water, but it feels very strange. You can also place certain blocks like doors to create air pockets underwater, which really cheapens the diving experience when you can just place a door to get all your breath back. Hytale should generally design things to feel realistic, or at least have them make sense, so flowing water should in most cases pass through non-full blocks. Some might block off water depending on the height though, like slabs should block off water that doesn't go above it, and it would be neat if there was some sort of force field block that could let players and mobs through but not water. To be fair, Minecraft Bedrock Edition does this a lot better than Java Edition, like flowing water can pass through things like levers and end rods, and generally a lot more blocks can be waterlogged. This was implemented in the Aquatic update, which is back when John Hendricks was working on Bedrock Edition, so good job, now make sure it's even better in Hytale. And when you place a source block in Minecraft, the water flows out into a diamond shape because of how diagonal water flow works. But maybe it would be more interesting if it instead spread out into an approximate circle. Basically, the water level could be decided by how far away it is from the source block instead of just checking adjacent flowing water. It would be more complex, but I think that it would make angular water flow look a bit better. And speaking of flowing water, why not take advantage of it with functional water wheels? These could add a lot to the game's aesthetic and mechanical systems and could be used to lift drawbridges, open gates, mill flour, and so on. It would also be a natural way to integrate water into builds beyond just decoration, making rivers feel more alive and interactive. And it can be used to make puzzles that use water flow or water spouts as mechanics. If Hytale is aiming for a world that feels dynamic and immersive, adding working water wheels would seem like an obvious choice to me. And when water is in freefall, it would be nice to see some nice waterfall effects. There are a lot of games that create very pretty waterfalls using shaders and VFX, but it can be a lot more difficult to pull it off in a sandbox game since you might not want to apply the effect to all running water. One thing you can do is to produce foam effects depending on how far of a drop it is and how deep the water is at impact. This is what the mod Effective does for Minecraft, which for a visual edition mod is very popular and well known because, well, people really like it. Waterfalls will also generate mist, but this only happens if there are 4 adjacent source blocks when flowing water hits the surface. This mod also adds interesting effects like water splashes depending on the force hitting the water, flowing water droplets, leaves falling on the water, and rain ripples. The mod Wakes also adds a nice trail behind boats, making movement feel way more dynamic. With more realistic water though, we can achieve ripple effects that are more similar to Hobno's physics mod by using displacement maps. If you combine this with the Hytale style of VFX, you can get some really cool effects for water splashes. The game Honkai Star Rail has some great looking interaction between abilities and water. I especially like this color ink effect that spreads on the surface. Another use case where ripples and VFX could add a lot would be with explosives. Detonating TNT underwater in Minecraft is probably the most anticlimactic thing that can happen in any video game ever, so by making it underwater explosives generate huge flashes and even waves, we can make it a lot more visually interesting. And when water splashes into the air, it shouldn't just fall back down like it's on a vacuum, but instead blow in the wind that is generating the waves in the first place. In ocean exploration games, wind is very important, and like in real life, the further out to sea you get, the windier it gets. Valheim and Sea of Thieves use wind streaks as visual indicators that show which direction the wind is going. Of course, this is not a real life phenomenon, but in games it's a nice aesthetic touch, as well as a great way to show the player which way the wind is blowing. Wind is something that should definitely affect waves depending on which direction it's blowing, and different areas of the game should definitely have different average wind speeds. It would be an important element of Howling Sands, obviously going from its name. We've already seen that this zone has sandstorms, and this clip is also a perfect example why the game has to be built around a wind parameter. Do you see what's wrong here? I'll give you a second. Yeah, so the sand is blowing to the right and down, but never up, which doesn't really make any sense. If all the sand is going down, how did it get up into the air in the first place? This looks more like a snowstorm than a sandstorm. But more importantly, the fires and the plants aren't reacting to the wind at all, just swaying back and forth at their own pace. And if you're from Florida, you'll have a pretty good idea of what palm trees look like during a storm, and this ain't it, chief. And the same logic applies to the ocean. Mathematical models like the John Swap spectrum can help simulate realistic ocean waves by factoring in wind direction, wind speed, distance from shore, and a whole bunch of other parameters. And when there are strong winds, waves can generate mist and spray, which should be affected by the same parameters for visual consistency. There are lots of visual elements that will be affected by wind: falling leaves, flags, banners, smoke, rain, snow, even clouds. But there is also a lot of potential for wind to interact with the mechanics of the game. The obvious one would be interaction with actual mechanical systems, like the popular idea of adding functional windmills, or it could even affect the fire spreading mechanics, spreading in the direction of the wind and at a faster rate the more wind there is. So say you want to burn down a chore camp on a windy day, you might want to place some explosives downwind from it to make the fire spread faster and kill more enemies. By making the systems this advanced, there is a lot more potential for creating emergent gameplay, where the systems can interact and create synergies. For example, air spells might power up fire spells, environmental effects like mist and sandstorms might power up water and earth spells, or by manipulating clouds and the weather, you can create conditions where you can use more powerful lightning spells. If Hytale has a temperature mechanic as well, which I've made a video about already, wind can interact with that system as well, making players and mobs colder and more vulnerable to ice magic, which would make it important to stay warm in cold biomes. And speaking of cold biomes, something that can be greatly improved with wind would be snowfall. In Minecraft, snow builds up only if there are no blocks obstructing from above, but this is not how snow works. In reality, snow will spread anywhere the wind takes it. Even when it's not snowing, the wind can still affect the snow, like in Skyrim, where the wind makes it drift across the surface. Unfortunately, snow in Hytale isn't something that builds up into layers like in Minecraft. It's all completely flat, and the texture doesn't really compensate for that either. It's a nice texture, and I can really tell it's trying to create the illusion of depth, but it doesn't really capture the feeling of fresh, pristine snow. Real snow is way more subtle, and can therefore be very difficult to capture on a 2D surface. The only places where you get dunes like these would be in high mountains where it's particularly cold and windy. Another method they use in an attempt to add depth to the snow is adding footprints when you walk on it, but these disappear almost immediately and aren't all that noticeable. I would have recommended adding snow layers, but we have to keep in mind that there are transition textures wherever the snow borders another block, so we need a better solution, and since snow is water, it makes sense to utilize the same techniques as we used there. Basically, what we can do is use vertex displacement to dynamically increase the height of the snow. This way, you could start building up the snow from the transition textures, and you could taper off the snow at the end of the blocks, quite literally taking the edge of them and creating a more rounded, fluffier, snowier looking terrain. Again, as a proof of concept, this is exactly what Hoblo's physics mod does, and instead of footsteps when you step in the snow, you compact it, creating a proper trail behind you, similar to the snow in Red Dead Redemption 2, though in there they use a displacement shader in combination with a technique called tessellation to create a bit more detail in the trail. This game in particular shows that with a great team of render artists, you can make snow look and feel amazing. I mean, look at this, it just looks so fluffy and satisfying, and just like water, snow has a specular reflection, so it shimmers beautifully in the moonlight. Hytale doesn't even need a system quite this advanced, but it's definitely something they could approximate. Using normal maps for snow should fit nicely in with Hytale, as they already seem to use normal maps for the ice shaders, so as a general rule here, if something is made from water, it doesn't need to consist of perfectly flat surfaces like the rest of the game, and it will look better if you add some detail to the surface. And speaking of ice, when mobs and entities stand on top of it, they should be affected by wind, since it's very difficult to keep your footing when there's no friction on the ground. This could also be used for puzzles, like those slidey block puzzles you see in all games. If you want to resist the wind while on ice, you better find some ice skates, which also gives you better mobility in general. The wind could also push detached ice sheets in frozen ocean biomes that act as moving block structures that drift through the water. Sometimes, ice can also replace snow altogether in the form of hail, which could also present some added environmental danger to Borea in Hytale. Hailstones can range from half a centimeter in circumference to half a meter, and in the worst cases, hailstorms have killed hundreds of people, so it can be a real threat if you are unlucky. Hail could also add a lot of character to cold oceans, like in Subnautica Below Zero, where the hail ominously penetrates the surface of the water. And like snow and hail, rain would also be affected by wind. When it rains, shaders could be used to make the ground look wet, which could also have some gameplay effects, like lowering friction on the ground. Wetness could also be treated like a status condition on players, making them more vulnerable to cold and lightning damage and more resistant to fire damage. And maybe it also slows down their walking speed a little bit. It would be very neat if you could combine water and lightning magic to deal extra damage and inflict additional status effects, while fire, warmth and wind could make the wetness go away quicker. Wind could also affect the sound engine, making sound travel further depending on the wind direction. Sound could also travel further across the ocean unless it's raining. This would interact well with a system like proximity chat. So we've established wind will be important for creating consistent visual and auditory effects, and has a lot of important applications for the mechanics and systems in the game, but the most important part it would affect would be ocean traversal. If you've spent any time exploring in Minecraft, I bet a huge chunk of that time was spent at sea. Oceans can be huge, so you will usually have to traverse them by boat, but for the longest time, traveling across the ocean in a boat was an incredibly boring experience. This got a lot better with Update Aquatic, when we got new aquatic enemies, new structures like shipwrecks with valuable loot, and new biomes like coral reefs. That meant there was a lot of new stuff to notice under the water, enticing the player into taking a detour or forcing a detour when the player gets pulled down by a bubble column. However, all of the upgrades that have been made to the Minecraft oceans have been confined to under the water. The actual surface of the water is still one continuous blue flat plane with absolutely nothing to tease your eye until you see land, and there is just zero mechanical complexity to traveling by boat. This is not okay. Traveling by boat should be fun. There are tons of games centered almost entirely around traveling by sailship, like Assassin's Creed, Black Flag, Windbound, and the list goes on. What I've learned from these games is that sailing can be very fun and challenging, because when you're sailing, you're not just worrying about steering, but also controlling the sail for optimal forward momentum by tacking and jibing to adjust to the shifting winds. Getting the hang of this can be very satisfying, especially when you're playing multiplayer and you can show off your skills by taking your friends on a fast ride across the ocean, or destroy enemies at naval combat if you can add cannons to the ship. If you have a hard time using the sailing mechanics, it would be nice to have the option to use wind magic to boost your sails. That way, you're not entirely at the mercy of the whims of the weather gods, and sailing would be much less frustrating. You could also add some dynamics to naval combat, allowing you to dodge cannon fire. Other spells and weapons could also be integrated in naval combat, like spreading oil on the surface, then lighting it on fire with a fireball, or creating a poison cloud downwind from your enemies, followed by a wind spell, letting the wind blow it along with them, or a water spell that can create a current. Naval battle could even happen in single player by introducing ghost ships or something like the skeleton galleons in Sea of Thieves. You could also battle sea monsters using cannons, harpoons, maybe even specialized arrows. You could also add shark attacks, as long as it's a fantasy monster shark like the Megalodon in Sea of Thieves. Real sharks rarely attack boats or humans. Lightning magic would also be very effective at sea, especially if you could manipulate the weather. There should also be a large variety of ships with different controls, speeds, durability, storage capacity, weapons options, and so on. They can also be deeply tied to progression, like in Valheim, where they are necessary for transporting resources like ores that can't be brought through portals. Some ships can have unique advantages, like the sloop in Sea of Thieves, that can sail directly against the wind, granting more maneuverability in exchange for much lower durability. For the ship's durability, there needs to be some sort of visual indicator of how damaged the ship is, and ideally it wouldn't be a health bar. There could even be a repair mechanic like in Sea of Thieves to keep your ship from sinking. You could even make custom ships, just like in Raft, using interactive moving block structures. You can already do this in Ryan H. Code's mod, Create Aeronautics. Just build anything you want and you can add buoyancy to your structure. You can even create functional submarines with enclosed areas that do not have water or any effects of water inside them. Some mods allow you to create more custom ships, like Aleki's nifty ships, giving you a bit more control and boatier looking boats, where you can add sails, cargo, cannons, and an anchor. And when you travel at sea, there needs to be a lot of visual variety between areas and ocean biomes, which can be difficult when we're going away from Minecraft's philosophy of being able to see everything under the water. So I would suggest making it so that warmer ocean biomes have calmer seas with clearer and more shallow water so that you can see the bottom. This should especially be the case for coral reef biomes, where you can get a rare and spectacular view of the colorful corals lit up from the sea pickles. Bioluminescence can also be used to great effect with certain biomes containing glowing kelp and jellyfish, much like the game Dredge. This fishing game takes a lot of inspiration from Lovecraftian horror, which really suits the ambience of dark, open waters, as well as Hytale itself, as it's clearly inspired by the same thing. So it could provide a template for how to create a good deep water ambience. This game really gives the ocean a sense of mystery, and it really emphasizes the mysterious nature of the ocean and the danger of darkness when you're at sea. When it gets dark, a thick fog appears, and suddenly you're dependent on having a good light source, otherwise you might run your boat into a reef, or something worse. But if you're not careful, your light might end up attracting a miasma, a mysterious cloud that can kill you. Enemies can range from small pests like bloodthirsty crows to terrifying leviathans massive enough to eat your boat whole. Even waterspouts will try to target your boat as if they are controlled by something. You really can't trust anything here, as even shipwrecks can turn out to be monsters out to kill you. As your panic grows, you will encounter more hallucinations and creepy events. And the mystery deepens as you catch increasingly strange fish. As you catch more and more, you will start to notice that something under the surface is mutating the fish, turning them into grotesque aberrations. Even people are being affected by this mysterious force. You discover ancient relics that give you strange magical abilities, and at sea you can find abandoned research stations, strange obelisks with unknown symbols, and ancient ruins of some kind of sunken city, hinting at a long forgotten past. So Dredge is a great example of how we can use mystery to make ocean traversal more interesting, but the actual fishing mechanic was quite literally an afterthought, as they weren't even planning on adding it in the first place, since the game is more about ocean traversal. The developers disliked heavily skill-based fishing minigames like in Stardew Valley, so they opted for a very simple fishing mechanic that was more about pulling the fish up faster instead of whether or not you could pull up the fish at all. The difficulty of pulling up the fish is kind of irrelevant here, since the real challenge is getting there in the first place. Fishing is a surprisingly common mechanic in all sorts of games, but its sole purpose in pretty much all of them is just to create a diversion from the regular gameplay loop by getting the player invested in a different, typically slower paced activity. It essentially interrupts your habits to give you a break, preventing you from getting bored with the game and stop playing. But ironically, the fishing mechanics in all these games tend to be on the boring side, so you have to wonder how effective they really are. Sure, fishing can just be relaxing, but just aiming for that is a lazy way out. There should always be an option to do lazy fishing, but it shouldn't be very rewarding beyond being an easy way to get food. So it's common to fall into the trap of making fishing too simple, but that's usually a missed opportunity to make an actually interesting and engaging system. If Hytale ends up being as successful as it seems it will, more hours are going to be collectively spent fishing in this game than most games' entire total playtimes, so it's not really a mechanic you'd want to half-ass. What type of fishing system will suit a game is heavily dependent on the context, but in general, if we want to create a great one, we need three things: complexity, variety, and incentive. There are lots of games that can get some of these aspects right, but I've never seen a single one that has nailed all three, and yeah, that includes actual fishing simulator games. It's going to be difficult to design, as it's a system that will have to accommodate people who just want to relax, as well as people who are looking for a real challenge. In other words, we need a mechanic that is deceptively simple. Luckily, this is exactly what fishing is in reality. Anyone can fish, regardless of skill level. If you put that hook in the water, eventually you'll catch something. But only people who know what they are doing will be able to reliably catch the fish they're looking for within a reasonable amount of time. So to make a perfect mechanic then, it would help to consult with someone who knows how to fish in real life, and as a coastal boy, you know, I'm something of a fisherman myself. So, what is fishing? Well, fishing is a simple act of moving a fish from a body of water to in the water, then preferably into your belly, though this last step is optional. There are a lot of ways to catch the fish, like using nets, harpoons, drop lines, crab traps, explosives if you enjoy being cruel, and waterbending? I've not tried this one yet, so I'm not sure how effective it is, but there's always the classic rod fishing. For now, I would like to focus on rod fishing, as it will likely be the most important way of catching fish in the game, and it's most likely the type of fishing you are the most familiar with, as it's what you've seen in pretty much any game that has fishing. But there are also different kinds of rod fishing, depending on whether you want the hook to sink or float. In most games, you use a bobber which floats on the surface and keeps the hook at a fixed distance under it. This is called float fishing, and is mainly used in freshwater and coastal fishing, as the fish aren't too far under the surface there. And while you can catch some pretty impressive fish this way, the real monsters live near the ocean floor, and if you want to catch these beasts, you're going to need a weighted tackle so that your lure can sink. Either way, catching fish with a rod is always a four-step process of finding the fish, throwing the line, hooking the fish, and then reeling it in. And to maximize the likelihood of catching the fish that you want, you'll need to find or create ideal conditions and use the right techniques. How this works will depend heavily on how the fish that you catch spawns. For example, in Minecraft, fish aren't real. They just kinda appear as a particle effect when biting your hook. Of course, there are fish mobs, but you can't catch them with a rod. You can, however, swim up to them without issue and kill them with a sword, which is usually more effective than fishing. So there's no point in fishing, except for catching books? Okay, now that I've put it that way, Minecraft really has the dumbest fishing system in any game I've ever seen. Making a system like this would be extremely easy, as you would literally just add a loot table for what you can fish, but also extremely boring, lame, and not exactly immersive when you can fish out of a single block of water. It would be much better if you could catch the actual mobs that are swimming around in the water, but then it's important that the fish are afraid of the player and swim away from them, so that they are more difficult to kill with a melee weapon, making fishing an actually viable method for catching fish faster. This would be a lot more interesting, as the fish you catch would be dependent on the environment you fish in, which is, fun fact, how fishing works. If you're worried that this will make fishing too slow, well, just spawn more fish near the player and make faraway fish ever so slightly attracted to the hook while fishing. And if there are multiple people fishing together, spawn and attract even more fish. Make it so that the more people are fishing together, the more fish they all get. That way, fishing becomes more of a social experience. But if you have to attract the actual mobs to be able to catch them, you become dependent on knowing where the fish are. So how do you find that out? The most obvious answer would be by just seeing the fish in the water. This is what most games do, which also explains why float fishing is the most popular type of fishing in games. You see the fish in the water or jumping out of the water, then try to throw the hook near them to catch them. Simple enough, right? This kind of system works well for fish that stay near the surface, but that's actually not all that common. Most fish tend to avoid the surface because of predators like birds, which is why you have a lot of seabird species that have evolved to become excellent divers, like the emperor penguin, which can dive over 500 meters, and even flying birds like guillemots that can dive over 200 meters. Another diving bird worth mentioning is gannet, which can tuck away their wings and turn into javelins, diving into the water like torpedoes at speeds up to 100 kilometers per hour. Gannets hunting is honestly one of the coolest sights in nature, but I've never seen them used in a video game before, so they're definitely a unique creature that Hytale could add. But anyway, fish tend to prefer deeper waters as they are less likely to be hunted from both above and below. If the water isn't too deep, there can also be a lot of nutrients on the seabed, and there are a lot more opportunities to camouflage or burrow, like my personal favorite fish, the halibut. And even if there are hardly any nutrients, the ocean floor will still be full of amazing deep sea creatures with weirdly D&D inspired names like the dragonfish and goblin shark. So if you're fishing in the ocean, you have pretty much zero visual cues telling you where the fish are. And no, don't say bubbles, because fish don't breathe air, you dummy. Though you could add some ripples like the disturbed water in Dredge. Nowadays we have echolocation that helps us detect schools of fish, although that can be difficult to use as they tend to give false positives, and it wouldn't really fit a fantasy game like Hytale. Some sort of fish detecting magic or ability would be nice, but it shouldn't be a core mechanic for fishing. Instead, you should be looking for indicators, the most obvious of which would be school of fish. Some fish, like sardines, feed on plankton, so schools of sardines will often come close to the surface. These are bait fish, which means they will also attract larger predators like cod and tuna. So by tracking their movements, you could try to predict their path, then equip a medium or large tackle. Sardines won't bite anything larger than them, so by fishing near them, they're effectively just bait. And since sardine schools are so large and swim near the surface, they're easy to spot, and they will also attract a lot of seabirds, like say, gannets, providing us another cue where we can find them. Using schools of fish as indicators like this would not only be realistic, but also a good mechanic that would help players catch fish a lot faster. Schools of fish aren't always a good thing though. For example, mackerels travel in large schools, but aren't very useful fish. They love to bite the hook though, so if you catch a mackerel, expect to catch nothing else unless you move to a different location. Mackerel populations have been in decline over the last few decades, but back in the day, we'd have to throw most of the mackerel back out because we got so many. It's a very fatty fish, and they don't stay fresh for long, and you get tired of eating them several days in a row, so we'd mostly use them as crab bait. Now, the spawning conditions and activity rates of fish would be based on a bunch of different factors, like whether it is freshwater or saltwater, as well as the biome, temperature, depth, altitude, water clarity, time of day, and the weather. To be clear, depth would be the distance below the surface of the water, while altitude would simply be the height coordinate. Moon phase would also affect spawn rates, as it can be very important for catching fish like swordfish and bluefin tuna. By the way, bluefin tuna are extremely rare, and if you catch one, you could earn yourself a hefty $3 million. What time of day fish are more active can depend on a lot of factors, like in colder waters, fish are more active at the warmest time of day, and fish in warmer waters may prefer sunrise or sunset as it's colder. The water gets colder during the night and much lower visibility, which some fish like, and there is less competition at night, which makes it a good time for predators like sharks to hunt. Bioluminescent plankton might attract certain fish at night as well, and as a rule of thumb, fish with big eyes tend to be nocturnal. In general, you are more likely to catch fish during storms, as they have a big impact on the underwater currents, stirring up nutrients from the seabed in certain places and increasing activity for bait fish and the fish that eat them. A lot of fish will also move into shallower water when it rains, and stronger currents can force fish closer to shore during storms. Near land, rain also washes insects and debris into the water, triggering feeding frenzies. So, fishing during a storm should get you more fish, especially by the coast. In some games, like Stardew Valley, some fish can only be caught in certain weather conditions, and though this just won't be the case in Hytale, weather can greatly affect the type of fish you'll catch, where you'll catch them, and how often you'll catch them. A great addition to the system would be an item that can manipulate fish spawn rates, like the chum bucket from Terraria. Chum is usually made up from chopped up leftovers from fish, and can be very effective at attracting fish near you until it dissipates into the water. In Terraria, the chum bucket is just an item drop, but it would be great if we could chop up different kinds of fish and use them as chum with different effects, like increasing the spawn rate of specific fish of increasing rarity. So chum made from common fish will attract uncommon fish, then uncommon fish will attract rare fish, and so on. That way, all fish will have some use, and we make fishing together even better, since all nearby player will benefit from the chum, just like a lure at a Pokestop in Pokemon Go. After you found or made a good environment for fishing, the next step would be throwing the line. This mechanic is typically fairly simple, just having to charge or flick the rod to throw the line further. The challenge typically comes in landing your throw in a precise location near the fish and avoiding potential obstacles like seaweed. When fishing for real, one thing you need to be aware about when throwing your line is not hitting any birds, because if you do, you suddenly have a huge problem. I don't know if this should be something that can happen in Hytale though, but I do like how you can use a fishing rod to pull mobs closer to you in Minecraft, and I would like to see that as a mechanic, so maybe if you hit a bird with your line, you can pull it towards you and it will just ragdoll to the ground before flying away. Could be funny. After you've thrown your line, the next step is getting the fish to bite the hook. If you can see the fish, this is pretty straightforward. Just keep the hook near the fish and reel it in occasionally to entice it into biting. If you can't see the hook though, you can maybe feel a nibble, indicating that something is about to bite, like in Animal Crossing. You could also make it so that you have to adjust the way you reel in, depending on the rate and intensity of the nibble. And the way you... Sorry, I lost my train of thought when I read jerking versus slow tug in my script. Stay with me here. Basically, fish that are more aggressive could be more likely to bite if you simulate bait fish, so you need to rapidly, jerk it to simulate a twitchy fish. While some fish are more cautious and might get scared away from too abrupt motions, so you need to reel it in more sporadically. You can also look at the way your rod bends to tell how heavy the fish is. Small fish and trash would be much lighter, so if your rod doesn't bend much, you can spool out or jerk the rod hard to unhook it. I really could have worded this better, but I'm too tired, sorry. For deep water fishing, you typically do what's called jigging, where you rapidly lift and drop your lure in a rhythmic motion to mimic a wounded fish. And when you spool out with a weighted tackle, you can tell if you hit the bottom if the line goes loose. When this happens, you need to pull the line up quickly before the hook gets stuck there, which is annoying as you'll have to pull really hard to get it unstuck, or break the line. If you want to catch fish on the bottom then, you need to keep your hook hovering slightly above the bottom. Big game fish, like tuna and swordfish, are particularly predatory, and the best way to catch them is to drag a line with scented bait behind a moving boat. This typically uses multiple lines, so it helps if you can attach some rods to the back of your boat. The best part of this method is that it's called trolling. And the type of bait you use should play a big role in what fish you attract and how effective your fishing is. Worms are good for general freshwater fishing, small fish attract larger predatory fish, fish chunks are great for deep sea fish and scavengers, while insects are great for fly fishing and surface feeding fish. Some bait could also leave a scent trail, similar to the chum bucket, attracting more fish over time. And speaking of the chum bucket again, Terraria is also a great example for bait, as there it comes in a lot of different qualities and will always be a deciding factor for how long it takes you to fish. And there's even special bait, like bait that lets you fish in lava, and even bait that lets you summon a boss. Other than all that, there could also be artificial lures, which would be reusable but might be less effective. More effective magical lures could be a nice piece of loot that you could find in underwater treasure. Alright, with that we can hook the fish, and the last part would be reeling it in. This is the part that has traumatized every Stardew Valley player with this pretty difficult fishing bar minigame. I personally like this system a lot, as it works well with the progression and the difficulty can be adjusted by using better tackle. But I don't think we should make reeling too difficult, at least for most fish, as a lot of people aren't necessarily looking for a huge challenge whenever they fish. I think the best way to do it would probably be with tension management, where the fish can get away if the line is too loose, or it can snap if it's too tight, losing your tackle. Pulling the line straight back might make you lose sight of the fish, so it's more useful to pull the rod to the side. You can reel in more as the fish gets tired. Far Cry is a good example of this system, where the line changes color to illustrate tension. It's often a good idea to pull in the rod as much as you can, jank it back to close some distance, then quickly reel in again. Like with Stardew fishing, it would be great if you could feel the fish's personality when you're reeling it in, so that you can guess what fish it is before you even get it. You could achieve that by changing their speed and movement patterns in the water while hooked. Aggressive fish would also be more likely to jump off the line, so they need to be reeled in faster. And when catching the fish, it would be nice to be able to hold a bucket in your offhand to catch it alive, like with the tactical fishing mod in Minecraft, or by placing a basket behind you. Reeling can also be made easier through cooperation. If you're in a boat with someone and the fish you're trying to reel is too heavy, the other person can follow it with the boat to close the distance, letting you reel in more. Or the other player could swim down and try to kill the fish while it's stuck on the line. Though that could be abused if they steal your fish, so you might want to make it so that only people in your party can do that. That just about covers how rod fishing works and could work in Hytale. But there are still many other ways to fish that could provide some variety. Some are passive, like crab traps and drop lining, both of which involve dropping traps attached with a rope to a float. These both require bait, so they can be a little bit of prep work to set up. I think it could be quite satisfying to drop them in the water and watch them sink, then pulling them up later, getting a bunch of fish, crabs and lobsters. Net fishing can be done in a lot of different ways, but essentially there's lift net fishing, where you submerge a net and pull it up when fish swim into it. Cast net fishing, where you throw a weighted net directly onto the fish. Seine and purse net fishing, where you drag a net through the water. Gill net fishing, where you place a wall of net and let the fish get stuck by the gills. And lastly, trawling, where you drag a net behind your boat. Some of these methods are a bit unethical, as they can be destructive to habitats, and all of these methods are harmful if used in excess, which causes overfishing. This could be illustrated through a game mechanic. What you can do is give each chunk a counter of how many fish have been caught with nets and reduce the fish spawn rate in that area until the population regenerates and it goes back to normal. The more you fish, the longer it takes for spawns to regenerate, so getting too greedy can be a big punishment. This way, players can experience the effects of overfishing firsthand, getting them to think about the ecosystem they inhabit, and if you're playing on a multiplayer server, it could even inspire collaboration between players in order to keep the ecosystem intact near densely populated areas. Or it could cause conflict and drama with players coming in from somewhere else to exploit your resources. Adding overfishing as a mechanic also creates an incentive to go exploring new waters over staying in one place while fishing, giving you a good excuse to go on your sailboat to chart new territory while trawling, like in Dredge, giving you multiple things to do at once. Granted, trawling can be damaging to certain habitats, so it can be one of these unethical methods of fishing, but it's too good of a mechanic to pass up. At least it's not as unethical as blast fishing though, which is when you kill the fish with explosives, like in Breath of the Wild of all games. In Hytale, this should obviously work, because I don't think fish should be immune to explosions, but it probably shouldn't be very effective, because when you explode fish, their air bladders rupture, causing them to sink around 90% of the time. So you'll kill the fish, but you'll have to go diving for them. And if you enjoy diving, you would probably enjoy pearl diving, which could be a fun activity in Hytale since there are already clams in the game. You could also farm different kinds of pearls by deliberately inserting different materials in clams, then harvesting them after a long while. And for those who enjoy farming, aquaculture could be another interesting way to get fish, where you capture the fish, selectively breed them to create more fish, as well as roe. The fish pond in Stardew Valley can also produce lots of different valuable items depending on the fish, though I'm a little confused why my lava eels are asking me to bring them mega bombs. Stardew Valley is also a good example of how you can add progression to fishing. Of course, it has the classic RPG style leveling, but you can also purchase new rods that gradually introduce the fishing mechanics. You start out with a training rod, which makes the fishing minigame a bit easier in the start, but it only lets you catch basic fish. With the next rod, you can catch any fish, with some added difficulty. The next after that adds bait, then the one after that adds tackles, and the final rod can add 2 tackles. You can get increasing quality of bait, and tackles work as horizontal progression, giving you different types of benefits, which you can cater to the type of fish you're trying to catch. So yeah, Hytale should definitely take inspiration from all this. Alright, cool. With all that, we can finally catch some fish. But then comes the big question, why? What's the point? Are there any incentives for the player to go out to sea and do all this? Well, fishing can provide a wide array of incentives to make it worth your time, from practical rewards to the calming or immersive experience of catching fish. The obvious reason to do it would be to obtain food. If fish were a source of actual good food and ingredients, there would naturally be a good reason to catch them. Good food could give temporary stat buffs like in Terraria, or could give you health and stamina buffs like in Valheim. The latter is an extremely good incentive to get food, as it can make you a lot stronger for a time. Cooking can be another reward in and of itself by adding a lot of visually interesting cooking methods like grilling, smoking, or even hanging them up to dry like a real Viking. A nice thing about Hytale is that it represents many different cultures around the world, and the best way to do so is through food. There are lots of cultures with iconic traditional seafood dishes like sashimi in Japan, bouillabaisse in France, ceviche in Peru, paella in Spain, or dried cod in Portugal, which they call bacalhau. But if you're not a big fan of eating fish yourself, you can always use them as bait to catch better fish, or to lure or distract monsters both on land and in the ocean. Some fish could even be used as special items to summon certain bosses. In Monster Hunter, special fish can be used as lure to capture monsters, and in Ark Survival Evolved, food is also used to tame dinosaurs. I heard some people wanted to ride raptors in Hytale, so maybe you can achieve that by fishing. What if they only like eating live fish? There's already rivers in the biome after all. Not all fish are edible though, so maybe some can be used for crafting materials like chitin, shark teeth, and poison sacs of various danger levels. Maybe rare fish have incredibly rare materials that you can only get through fishing. If some fish have magical qualities, like white piranhas, maybe they could be important ingredients for potion crafting. Other ingredients might require you to breed the animals, like getting ink from squids and cuttlefish. And another obvious reward would just be plain old money. You could meet exotic fish merchants that buy rare fish for large sums of money, or you could sell fish at player auctions as long as someone has an incentive to buy them. There could also be a coastal NPC race where you can gain a lot of reputation if you sell the fish, like how you can get faction reputation by selling to the Hunter's Call faction in Sea of Thieves. Some NPCs might ask for a specific fish, like the angler in Terraria, and there's also the community center, help wanted quests, and special orders in Stardew Valley that can give special rewards, and story quests which are actually required to progress in the game. Sometimes the challenge can be a reward in and of itself. You could have diegetic server leaderboards for the biggest fish, or event NPCs that spawns in the ocean and trigger fishing competitions. Certain events could be tied to getting specific rare fish as well. Or you could have tournaments like the Strangletorn Fishing Extravaganza in World of Warcraft, or the seasonal ice fishing event in Stardew Valley. The challenge could also just be to catch them all, whether it's just to get in-game achievements, or a fish compendium that players can fill in, or even NPCs that provide special rewards if you fill out their collections. There could also be special versions of each fish, like rare XXL fish or fish with special textures, sort of like Pokemon shinies, or variations of fish like the aberrations in Dredge. Fish could also be seen as decorative elements, like the live fish in the aquarium in Animal Crossing, or fish trophies like the trophy boards in Raft. Alternatively, you could skip a step and fish up the rewards right away, but you should be very careful with this, as it could end up cheapening the experience, like how fishing in Minecraft just feels like a boring random item generator. In Minecraft, you're only really interested in getting books of mending, to the point where getting anything else is purely a punishment. Getting books from water is also just nonsensical and immersion breaking. I rated 1 out of 10. In Stardew Valley, these rewards are slightly better as they come in the form of optional treasure chests that can be obtained through the reeling minigame. They take a bit of skill to obtain, as you have to sacrifice progress on reeling the fish to get the treasure. These are also quite common, as the rewards are typically minor, but you also have a small chance of getting something super rare, which kind of feels like a bonus, not a necessity, because there are other equally good ways of obtaining those items. If there are unique rewards though, they should be related to fishing. Terraria has crates of different rarities and themes, and these are one of the few ways to get the coveted master bait. Oh, okay, very funny. I hope you're proud of this one, Redigit. When you reel in, treasure wouldn't put up a fight like a fish would, so it would feel a lot different. Maybe treasure could be too heavy and slow to reel in, so once you get some on your hook, you can instead choose to dive to get it. Or if you're on a ship, you could use some sort of dredging mechanic. In Wind Waker, the grappling hook can be equipped on your boat, letting you dredge up sunken chests, and in Breath of the Wild, you can use your magnet ability to pull up metallic chests from the water. That just about covers the extrinsic rewards, but there are also ways to enhance the mechanics to make them inherently rewarding. In game design, intrinsic rewards are always much more important and allows the player to have much more meaningful interactions with the game, driving up long-term player engagement. And they can be done by making the mechanics fun, satisfying, or challenging to engage with. When you catch a fish, it would be nice if the character held it up for a bit to revel in your achievement, instead of it going directly into your inventory. The most important part of the equation, though, would be to make fishing more socially engaging. To achieve this, a good case study would be web fishing, a cozy and fun fun chatroom experience centered around fishing. A lot of its charms come from its visuals, the cute art style, the funny faces characters can make, the funny hats they can wear, and the ridiculously big fish they can catch. Chat messages also appear as bubbles above the players' heads, and like Animal Crossing, the messages are vocalized, making chatting more fun. Making a social space was also what we were aiming for in the last Hytale Thankmas, where we made a special fishing minigame for the server, where the idea was to have a chill and social activity that people could do while enjoying the stream. The social experience can also be enhanced by adding more social systems along it, like proximity chat. Otherwise, making the fishing mechanic immersive will help enhance the gameplay experience, allowing you to get more immersed in your world. Sound design can help a lot in this department. And fishing allows the player to get a change of pace in their gameplay, breaking them out of repetitive patterns. Becoming overly accustomed to repetitive tasks or patterns is known as habituation, and over time it can end up reducing engagement and enjoyment of the game, making players want to stop playing. Changing the nature of the task then can allow your brain to dishabituate and prevent that from happening. Basically, fishing is an extremely important mechanic to get right, as when done right, it can keep your players engaged with the entire game much longer. But you have to be very careful with how you design the mechanic. If you create a system like Minecraft, where the actual or valuable rewards are given out to sporadically and completely unpredictably, you've effectively created a slot machine that taps into your brain's reward system through the use of intermittent reinforcement. You might think this can drive up player engagement, but no, this is very bad. Even though this is nowhere near the harm of actual gambling, it can still foster addictive behavior, it feels annoying and stressful, and can have negative long-term impact on mental health, especially for children. It can also lead you to engaging with systems that you're not really enjoying, but you choose to put up with anyway just so you can get the reward. I usually get totally burned out on Minecraft because when I want to put mending on my gear, I make an XP grinder and go on a fishing spree that lasts for way too long, and when I'm done, I get so tired of the game that I quit for months or even years. The best way of preventing this from happening is making rewards from fishing more predictable and not overemphasizing rare rewards. This way, we can maintain engagement while fostering a healthier and more enjoyable gameplay experience. So far, we mostly talked about what happens above the surface of the water. It's important to keep in mind that while this is its own unique environment, the surface of the water also acts as a portal to a whole different world underneath. This is the realm of all those fish you're trying to catch, and while it can be beautiful and serene, it can also be a hostile and dangerous place. Underwater sections of games have a bad rep, as it's often associated with tedious and slow movement, awkward controls, and generally sluggish and stressful gameplay. This usually happens because the game designers ask themselves, how can we make this more realistic? And the answer to that question is just to make it more difficult to move around. What they need to be asking instead is, how can we make the water something that enhances the gameplay? And it is clear that this is something that the game designers of Hytale have already asked themselves, as we can clearly see that the game has scuba gear and flippers, two things that greatly enhance the movement through water. This is important, as the only water sections of games that people seem to enjoy are those that are fast-paced, with smooth movement, like Donkey Kong Country, Tropical Freeze, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Celeste, and the Rayman games. The best one has got to be Abzu, which has this incredibly beautiful, graceful, and fluid motion. They really paid attention to every detail here, like in the way the character accelerates with each stroke, and when turning, the camera is predictive instead of static, creating a better third-person experience. And what every single one of these games have in common is that you can dash or boost your speed with the press of a button. In first person, a scuba mask HUD, like in Subnautica, can make the player feel more claustrophobic, which would be appropriate, as players would likely use first person more in tight spaces. Hytale also has weapons like daggers that give extra movement abilities, so it'd be nice to have a range of underwater weapons like spears and tridents with special abilities that make diving more fun, like when you enchant a trident with Riptide in Minecraft. This kind of spin attack is great for mobility, it's fun to use, and it even works in rain, which is honestly a stroke of genius. It would be great to have an ability to create temporary underwater currents using some sort of underwater Fusroda to give yourself and other players a speed boost, or you could use it to strategically push away enemies. Actually, now that I think about it, it would be really cool if air and fire magic could create currents when used underwater. There could also be mobs that buff movement like dolphins in Minecraft, though I have to admit, this made me cage a bunch of dolphins in bubble columns to make a permanent speed boost, so maybe it would be better if the players hiked with the mobs instead, like in Abzu, where you can latch onto sharks, manatees, manta rays, whales, and giant turtles. Another thing that can give you speed boost while swimming is simply being able to kick away from the surface to propel yourself forwards. This would be a fun addition to the movement, and I'm shocked not more games implement it. I wouldn't shy away from making the movement without aquatic gear feel a little sluggish though, since that would make progression feel even more meaningful as you unlock better gear and you feel a gradual increase in mastery. But in that case, it shouldn't feel tedious to have to carry around and swap to your gear, meaning there should be separate equipment slots for aquatic gear, and your player should automatically switch to it when you enter water or dive below the surface. There should also be some things that limit your movement, like foliage or water pressure when you dive deeper. This could add to the thematically scary side of diving underwater, and could be a dynamic way of adding difficulty. You should be very careful with how you hinder movement though, as it should only apply to situations that are supposed to make you feel scared and helpless. It's also nice when there are more ways to get oxygen underwater, like plants that create big oxygen bubbles, or maybe air magic. Permanent structures like the conduit that gives water breathing and mining speed would also be great. In games like World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 2, you can also obtain aquatic mounts to move better in the water, and I'd like to see a variety of submarines like in Subnautica. There are also mechanical suits in this game, which could translate to golems in Hytale. Oh, and a nice touch would be if the player emotes look different when performed underwater. In Hytale, the players can also turn into animals, so turning into aquatic animals with druidic spells could provide a whole new type of movement, gameplay, and combat. And if you could turn into aggressive animals like a shark, it would be fun if you could wreak absolute havoc like in the game Maneater, or you could terrorize your friends like in Depth. If you ask me, Hytale will either let us be a shark or jump the shark. No in between. But real talk, I think it would be extra important to think about the experience of playing aquatic animals in general, as it would work quite differently to everything else. There could also be an item like the Neptune's shell from Terraria, which automatically turns the player into merfolk when entering the water, or the Soros mask from Majora's Mask, which also gives the player new underwater attacks. And this is important to keep in mind. The water isn't just a place for exploration, but it can also be an introduction to a whole new combat system within the game. In theory, underwater combat has a lot of potential, as it adds a whole new dimension of vertical movement to the equation. This means that you can dodge attacks not just from side to side, but also up and down, so dashing would be an important combat ability. Homing attacks would also become more powerful because of the added dimension, and environmental hazards would come in more varieties, like squid squirting ink, or powerful currents that can be created by blocks like bubble columns in Minecraft, or abilities. Another hazard would be sea mines that could float around like mobs in the water, and you could potentially create currents to push the mines into your enemies. Currents would also allow you to control the movement of your enemies and would be important for crowd control. Magic should work differently underwater too. Lightning magic would turn into dangerous area of effect attacks that would easily backfire on the caster. Water magic would probably become more powerful and earth magic weaker. With earth magic, I think it would make sense to make the attacks sharper so they can move through the water better. Air and fire should probably be used mostly for mobility, and void magic could really take advantage of tentacles to merge with the eldritch horror theme of the ocean. For weapons, it would be a neat feature to be able to make them faster underwater, like an enchantment or something, or using special underwater arrows for bows. You could also tie combat into fishing, like the Yakuza 6 minigame, where you go spearfishing and fight an overly dramatic boss battle at the end. I would love to hunt some monsters in the deep dark waters. And speaking of hunting monsters, they did introduce underwater combat in Monster Hunter Tri, but this had the fanbase split. On one hand, the combat was slower, you had to manage your oxygen, and it was more difficult to dodge, so it felt like you kept taking damage that was out of your control, which feels unfair. On the other hand, this could add a natural difficulty progression to boss battles, where monsters would move into the water after you weaken them on land, and when entering the water, the monsters can use more abilities, making them more powerful. It's important to keep in mind that feeling helpless can add to the tension. Like, if I was going to fight a crocodile, I would not want to do it in the water. So there's an argument for making underwater combat more punishing, at least until you unlock proper aquatic gear and abilities. This idea of restricted movement was also taken further in Monster Hunter Rise, which added mud battles and applied the same principles to snow battles, while the vertical axis was explored more through the addition of wire bugs, giving the player more vertical movement options and access to new powerful attacks for more high-octane combat. Aquatic gear in Hytale could aim to do the same for underwater combat, giving the players more mobility, especially on the vertical axis. And when you go underwater in Guild Wars 2, your character goes into underwater mode, where your headgear is automatically swapped into aquatic headgear and you equip your aquatic weapon. This was done because an oxygen system was seen as tedious, and having to swap into your aquatic gear manually anytime you went into the water even more so. There are also equipment slots specifically for your aquatic gear, so you don't have to worry about clutching your inventory with it. While you're in the water, you can swap between two aquatic weapons, which can be either harpoon guns, spears, or tridents. These weapons give you custom underwater abilities that take full advantage of the added vertical dimension, especially for area of effect abilities, and abilities that make your enemies sink or float or get stuck in a vortex. And like most good multiplayer combat system, there is a down mechanic in this game, and when you get down underwater, you can attempt swimming up to the surface to heal back up. Rangers also have aquatic companions that can help them attack underwater, though it would have been nice if you could attack with your mount too. And speaking of mobs, it's difficult to get underwater environments right because there are typically thousands of fish in any given location at any time, which can be heavy on performance. So what they did in Absu, instead of rigging the fish models, they used static mesh instancing and used algorithms to animate them, allowing them to put up to 10,000 fish on the screen at any given time. These fish can also interact with the environment, giving them a real sense of presence. Even though all the mobs in Hytale are made up from boxes with rigid animation, you shouldn't be afraid of bending the models of fish, as it could give the water a very different vibe to the rest of the game, emphasizing that it's a different world down there. I recommend watching the GDC talk creating the art for Absu, or even reach out to the devs directly if you want to try this. Like on land, the water is an ecosystem, so aquatic creatures should interact with each other dynamically to enhance immersion, like fish eating smaller fish, which also ties into fishing mechanics. As a tribute to cetacean intelligence, the AI of dolphins, orcas and larger whales should also be some of the most advanced tech in the game, to really endear us to these creatures. I would really hope to see their playful nature shine through, and how they hunt cooperatively in pods. It would be amazing to see cetacean hunting methods recreated in the game, like how dolphins stir up the seabed in shallow waters to trap school of fish, or how orcas break the ice sheets to hunt seals. And much like crows and elephants, whales are known for their memory, so if you feed them or protect them from enemies, it would be awesome to see them remember you, or even protecting you from threats like sharks, or worse. There could be some seriously scary creatures in the water, which would definitely be a good thing, as the developers of Subnautica reckon that their Leviathan is responsible for most of their YouTube views and most of their game sales by extension. Just don't make Leviathans spawn in the pond outside my house, please. Difficulty should be mostly tied to depth. In Guild Wars 2, the aggression level of aquatic mobs will depend on how deep the player is, so if you swim towards the surface, you're more likely to lose hostile attention. Just like in Monster Hunter, the amphibious mobs have different attacks in the water here. For example, the Drake can breathe fire on land but not in the water, and even NPCs will swap to their aquatic weapons. This leads to situations where the player has to judge which environment would be best suited for battle. So when designing amphibious enemies, it's a good idea to take into account their preferred environment and make sure they try to get there when they are weakened, so they can try to get an advantage while fighting. And mobs that are stronger in the water generally wouldn't want to walk too far away from a body of water, as that could be really dangerous to them. Bodies of water can also provide the player with unique resources, like in Ark Survival Evolved and Scrap Mechanic, where going underwater is important to harvest crude oil. You can also dive for pearls in Ark and No Man's Sky, and in Terraria, chests in the ocean give aquatic items and gear. Geothermal vents on the ocean floor can be a good source of sulfur, which could be used to make gunpowder and fertilizer, or maybe you could harvest some special gases. If you need more inspiration for resource vents, oxygen not included is the best place to look for that. The ocean floor is also a great place to spread some ancient relics that can provide hints at the lore, preferably with valuable resources nearby to incentivize seeking them out. Another thing worth seeking out would be underwater dungeons. We already know there are instance dungeons in Hytale, so giving some of them a water theme would be a nice way to add some variety. These should be difficult to complete unless you have the proper gear for underwater movement and combat, and they could offer aquatic themed loot just like Terraria's water chests, and they could take full advantage of the water mechanics and add water-based puzzles. And yeah, bad water levels in games are a bit of a joke, but when done right, they can be fun and memorable experiences, like the Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask. I love the ambience and environment in this place. Unfortunately, underwater environments are often unimaginative, usually settling for a theme like tropical coral reefs and calling it a day. But there are so many more themes that can be explored in underwater environments, like ice, volcano, jungle, mangrove, bioluminescent underwater forest, alien life, eldritch horror, rusty industrial, fairy tale fantasy, and so on. Less than a tenth of the oceans have been explored, and games are a great medium to imagine what could be out there, and Hytale is a great opportunity to get extra creative with it. It's also important that environments feel dynamic and interactive, like in Absu where kelp brushes against you, you push aside lilies and kick up sand when you swim along the bottom. It would also be great if foliage was affected by any currents created by the player. This would mean kelp would have to move outside their voxel boundary, which shouldn't be an issue if they're quick to return into their default position. Environmental storytelling can also be introduced through world generation, like craters or cracks formed by massive creatures, remnants of huge skeletons, and shipwrecks that hint at ancient civilizations. The ocean environment really is a place with a lot of potential to build an ambience of beauty and terror. And what also helps build the underwater ambience is its unique soundscape. Since water is much denser than air, sound travels 4 times faster and carries lower frequencies much better. The surface of the ocean floor is also an excellent reflector, so shallow waters can be very echoey. And the surface of the water also reflects sound, so you can hardly hear anything from the water if you're standing above the surface. In reality, when submerged in water, we can't actually absorb the sound with our ears since they are almost entirely made out of water. So the sound is instead absorbed by our much harder bones. Which means, when you are underwater, you have no way to tell where a sound is coming from. This kind of realism is something games tend to move away from though, unless they are aiming to really imitate the oppressive feeling of being submerged in water. There are also many unique sounds that you typically only hear in water, like the creaking hull of a ship, icebergs collapsing, the calls of whales and dolphins, and hydrothermal vents, to name a few. These can be extremely creepy, and there's a whole genre of videos on YouTube talking about unidentified deepwater sounds. Never watch them after 3 AM. The aquatic ambience has also inspired some of the most iconic music in gaming, like, well, Aquatic Ambience from Donkey Kong Country and Dire Dire Docks from Super Mario 64. We also saw the use of adaptive music during the Nintendo 64 era with the game Banjo & Kazooie, where the music would seamlessly bridge over to an aquatic version of the same theme. The music shouldn't just aim to be relaxing and transient though, as it is also important to capture the tension that comes with being underwater. Adaptive music can also gradually change when you dive deeper or when you're running out of air to induce a healthy splash of anxiety. Extra creepy enemies can even have their own musical cues to instill fear in the players. Think the Guardians from Breath of the Wild. Or you can learn a lesson from the movie Jaws and make it so that when a threat is approaching in the distance, an ominous theme starts building up until it attacks. I really hope Hytale leans into this more terrifying part of the ocean, since underwater settings lend themselves well to horror themes. The restricted movement can make you feel really helpless and acts as a constant reminder that you are out of your element. There's also the constant threat of losing your most basic physiological needs, which is the #1 priority of our brains. And the deeper we dive, the worse the threat becomes as the water pressure increases. This water pressure can actually be seen very clearly, as increased pressure increases refractions, causing higher wavelengths like red to dissipate much faster. This means that when you dive deeper, the water doesn't just become darker, but warmer colors also become more desaturated, creating a very unsettling visual effect as you descend into the cold, unforgiving abyss. In video games, all that can be magnified by the underwater setting, making you feel even more submerged, immersed in the game world. Immersion really is the key to good horror. This is best exemplified by Subnautica, where the developers never aimed to make a horror game, they just made it more and more immersive until it naturally became one. There are lots of unique horror games set underwater, like Silt, Still Wakes the Deep, Death in the Water, and Iron Lung, and there are also iconic classics like Bioshock and Soma, which both use the underwater setting to create a unique and oppressive atmosphere. The way water can isolate you makes it an especially good place for co-op horror, something that was recently explored in the game Murky Divers. The creepy underwater ambience is fun to experience with friends, but in this game it's been made even creepier and more intense by the addition of proximity voice chat! Man, prox chat games have really popped off since Lethal Company. It's almost as if the players love it, and it guarantees that your game will be successful. Anyway, another thing that could make the underwater atmosphere creepier but also more realistic would be by simulating Snell's window, like they did in Subnautica. Basically, when light hits the surface of the water, it will refract based on the angle it enters, creating a circular window-like effect where everything above the water is visible within a 96-degree cone. If the light is beyond this angle, you get what we call a total internal reflection, where the surface reflects all the light like a mirror, so the water surface, seen from below, will always look like a circular window. And I said this before, but I will reiterate, please add God rays. They add so much to underwater environments. What else is there to talk about regarding water? Oh yeah, water is something we need to stay alive, so why not also make it something we need in the game? Thirst is not just something experienced by tier 3 Gaia subs, as there's also the thirst mechanic, which can add a lot of challenge to survival games by giving you another resource to manage. You might then tell me that Hytale isn't a survival game, but that's not true. Hytale is whatever the player wants it to be, and by that logic, the developers should give them all the staple mechanics to make it into an immersive survival game if they want. Ideally, it would be as easy as making it a game rule you can enable in your world, and then the thirst mechanic can be seamlessly integrated with all the other systems in the game as well as new systems that the modders want to add. Thirst also works great in an underwater game like Subnautica, even though you are surrounded by water. That's because the water around you is too salty, so drinking it would be not good, really bad even. This only really works if the water is actual saltwater. In Vintage Story, you can choose to generate your world with saltwater, which acts as a separate liquid to regular water. This saltwater is toxic to crops, and if there was a thirst mechanic in this game, you would definitely not be able to drink it. Speaking of crops, that's another place where Hytale differentiates itself from other block games. Simply filling in a block of water near your farmland is not enough to keep it hydrated, and instead you have to use a watering can. That gets me thinking, what happens if there is a water block nearby? Does the farmland get overwatered? Would that be how you farm more water-hungry crops like rice? And does rain hydrate the farmland as well, like in Stardew Valley? And speaking of Stardew, can you make sprinklers? Maybe you can use water magic to summon rain clouds. I feel like that could make watering your crops redundant fairly quickly, but they would be nice features regardless. Something else that would need to stay hydrated would be animals. I think adding a thirst mechanic to the mobs in Hytale would actually add a lot to the gameplay. It would mean that you would have to make sure to provide a water source for your farm animals, making farming a bit more immersive, and it would also give wild animals more believable behavior, like animals of the savannah regularly gathering around watering holes. And that brings us to waterboarding. Wait, no, wrong script. Here we go. That brings us back to what's at the core of all of this, the water. I didn't want to get too technical earlier, but now that I got you hooked, so to speak, I want to figure out how the water shaders work and explore how we can improve them. And what I found was that the water in Hytale uses two types of surface simulation. For the shape of the waves, it uses vertex displacements, which controls the movement of the surface mesh, and for the ripples on the surface of the water, it uses normal maps, which is like a texture that fakes the way the light bounces off the mesh. The surface of the water looks a bit like plastic, which is very reminiscent of older games, so if I had to guess, the lighting works something like this. Color is added through ambient lighting, and shading is added using something called the Lambertian diffuse, which models the light that is scattered after hitting a surface, as well as specular highlights that add bright spots when reflected light is aimed straight at your eyes, using what's called the Blend-Fong specular. As for reflections, Hytale actually uses the latest in high-end ray tracing technology to create accurate simulations of the light hitting the water. Huh? Hello? Yes? Okay. I understand. Thank you. Sorry, that was a big toaster. I've been informed that their smart toasters do not in fact support ray tracing. As such, Hytale is limited to using screen space reflections, which can reflect the scene, but only whatever is visible on the screen at any given time. Though that probably won't be too big of an issue, since the water in Hytale only reflects a very limited amount of the environment, and the reflections are very diffused. The sky is also reflected in the water, and this is quite simple, because the sky consists of a skybox, basically a simple cube with textures, which can be sampled for reflections without using much processing power. Also, if you look at the water from above, you don't see any reflections at all, which happens because of the Fresnel effect, which basically means that a surface is more reflective when viewed from a grazing angle, basically from viewpoints that are closer to the surface and further away from the point of reflection. The same principle also applies to the specular highlights, which are only visible when looking towards the horizon. The water animation here is essentially just a mix of a bunch of sine waves that change the height and surface orientation of the water, a method known as sum of sines. This is very simple, meaning it takes very little resources and it looks great in smaller bodies of water, where there typically isn't a lot of turbulence. The main issue arises when you have larger bodies of water, especially out in the rough seas, where waves have much sharper peaks and broader throws. Small round waves look really out of place here and certainly do not inspire ideas of epic ocean adventures. Luckily, this can be fixed fairly easily. You just have to check for the depth of the water and how far out the surface is from the shore. Then you start to mix in some other types of waves that can produce the desired shape. There are a lot of different types of waves that you can pick from, but the most popular solution would be the Gerstner wave, which is a mathematical model for ocean waves created all the way back in 1802. Basically, the points of the surface don't just move up and down, but also back and forth through a circular motion. The main problem of using Gerstner waves is that they can loop in on themselves, so instead of controlling wave height with amplitude, it needs to be capped depending on the surface pressure and measured by its steepness. And the waves you add to the equation can't be completely random either, as that just gives you complete chaos that doesn't really look like water at all. So to fix that, we can add fractional Brownian motion to ensure each new wave added has a higher frequency and lower amplitude. This gives us a fine control of how detailed we want the water to be, where fewer waves means a more stylized look, and more waves looks more realistic. We can also make it look like the waves are pushing each other around by adding domain warping, which basically distorts the input coordinates of a wave using the previous wave. If you want the water to look more like in Valheim, we can use the same method of SSR and cube map reflections, but we'll need to play with the parameters so that still water becomes a bit more reflective. Now, the problem with this method is that when applying it to a large body of water like an ocean, the waves will tile and you get very noticeable repeating patterns. What games like Sea of Thieves do to avoid this is simulating an ocean real time using something called fast Fourier transform in combination with an ocean wave spectra like JonSwap that lets you input a bunch of variables like depth, wind speed, and direction into the equation. This results in way better looking water at the expense of quite a lot of processing power. That wouldn't be an issue if we were just talking about a graphical improvement, but water also affects gameplay since the waves interact with entities, so they must have the same shape for every device, meaning every device has to run the same simulation. And to make matters worse, the graphical part is calculated on the GPU, while the buoyancy of objects in the water is calculated on the CPU, which is a problem because it takes time for these two to communicate with each other, so achieving this interaction between entities and the surface of the water means we have to either run an additional instance of the water simulation on the CPU, or find a way to run the buoyancy on the GPU. Luckily, the buoyancy calculation wouldn't have to be as high fidelity as a graphical one, since we don't need to be affected by every little ripple in the water. But alternatively, it is also possible to calculate buoyancy on the GPU, so this could be an option worth exploring. More complex wave simulation would also only really be needed in open waters, which means that there wouldn't be much else there to render, so it would be okay for the game to spend a bit more resources on the water. But because Hytale needs to run on low-end devices, a realistic FFT ocean would only be possible if you could heavily optimize it, which would be extremely tricky. It might not be necessary though, as you can get quite good looking water with systems like Unity's Universal Rendering Pipeline, which is optimized for open and flexible rendering and has scalable graphics quality to allow play on low-end devices. If you look at their boat attack demo from years ago, you can see that it has water that could potentially fit with Hytale, and it has buoyancy and all that good stuff, so something similar could definitely be achievable for the game. Then you would also have to make it so the vertex displacement is also affected by objects in the water to make it interactive. This shouldn't be too big of an issue, as games like Fair already had this kind of interactive water all the way back in 2005. In general, it may be worth allocating a bigger amount of resources into developing the water tech, as having more dynamic water could make it stand out a lot from what you would expect from a block game. Proper water tech would also be something that could justify Hytale's existence as a standalone game and put some ridicule to the idea that it's not any different to its spiritual predecessors. It would make it immediately obvious that the game is so much more refined and dynamic and not held back by any preconceived restrictions of the genre. Of course, games like Sea of Thieves have such great water systems precisely because these games revolve specifically around naval battle and exploration, which isn't the case for Hytale, so it doesn't have the luxury to put that big of a portion of the budget towards developing these systems. So what's important right now is to make water that feels good to interact with and makes for a good basis that can inspire further development and refinement down the line. Even if it's not a perfect simulation, any sort of dynamic wave system implemented at this stage would at least plant a seed for the future to improve over time. Is it necessary for the minimum viable product here? Probably not, but even if you can't get this done before release, it's not uncommon for games to improve their water simulation post-release, like how Cyberpunk 2077 went from having some of the worst water in next-gen gaming to some of the best. I don't think many people would really expect Hytale to have high quality water, but instead of thinking that's something you don't need to worry about, how about thinking of it as something you can use to blow everyone out of the water?